You might find this surprising, but there's actually a pretty direct line from the incredibly lavish court of King Louis XIV straight to the modern sport of fencing we see today.
It's not the most obvious connection, is it?
Yeah.
But it's definitely there.
So today we're doing a deep dive into the reign of the Sun King, his Grand Siècle, to explore how it fundamentally reshaped swordsmanship.
Yeah, laying the groundwork for the kind of fencing you see in the Olympics now.
We'll be looking at how weapons changed, how techniques transformed, and interestingly, the big rise in status for fencing masters during his rule.
And we're drawing on some really fascinating historical accounts for this.
Exactly. Our mission really for this deep dive is to understand those key changes in fencing under Louis XIV.
And to sort of pinpoint their lasting impact on the modern sport.
Right, to give you a clear, concise, but still thorough picture of how fencing evolved historically during that period.
It's quite remarkable, how several different things kind of converged during Louis XIV's time.
Like what specifically?
Well, our sources show royal favor playing a big part. Shifts in court fashion, believe it or not.
Yeah.
And even just the practical need for safer training methods.
So it wasn't just one big thing, but lots of smaller factors.
Precisely. It shows that, big historical changes aren't always driven by huge dramatic events. Sometimes subtle shifts in everyday life, like fashion, can have these really profound, long-lasting effects.
Okay, let's start with something maybe a bit unexpected. The social standing of fencing instructors back then. It seems like under Louis XIV, they weren't just marginal figures.
Not at all. The Academy of Masters of Arms, which had already been around since 1567, mind you, saw its privileges confirmed and even significantly expanded.
And Louis XIV himself, he held them in high esteem.
Very high esteem, high enough that he actually ennobled some of them, granting hereditary titles. That's quite something.
Wow, okay, so that royal endorsement must have really boosted their standing.
Absolutely, it's a key development. That royal seal of approval brought this unprecedented level of prestige and, importantly, stability to the profession.
Which meant their knowledge could be passed down more systematically.
Exactly. It ensured that fencing knowledge, the techniques, would be passed down and refined through proper schools and respected instructors. Fencing started shifting from just a practical skill to, well, a recognized and respected discipline.
Okay, let's pivot now to something that seems, on the surface, totally unrelated: fashion.
Ah, yes, the close.
It turns out the styles popular in Louis XIV's court, sort of late 17th century, had a direct impact on the swords people carried.
It really did. The dominant sword for ages had been the rapier, long and slender, but it just became impractical with the kind of clothes men were wearing at court.
So too cumbersome for the silks and breeches. What replaced it then?
Well, this is a great example of how cultural trends can nudge even martial practices. The rapier was just too bulky, too long for the more streamlined, form-fitting outfits.
So a practical problem needed a solution.
Right, and the solution was the adoption of the short, much lighter court sword. You hear it called the épée de cour.
The épée de cour.
Okay, and this wasn't just a cosmetic change.
Oh no, far from it. It fundamentally altered how people approached swordsmanship.
How so? Was it seen as better?
Well, this new épée de cour was quickly seen as ideal, really. Light enough you could use it effectively with just one hand for both attacking and defending.
And that was different from the rapier.
Yes, if you recall the rapier, our sources mention it was used for both thrusting the estoc and cutting the tail.
Right, thrust and cut.
But the court sword, its primary use was the point for attack. The blade itself was mainly for parrying, for defense.
So a definite shift towards point work.
A very distinct shift. If you think about the bigger picture, it's a major departure from that earlier style that used both cut and thrust, which you saw with heavier swords like the rapier.
And that focus on the thrust with a light, single-handed weapon.
That's a defining feature, that carries right through to modern fencing. It's one of the core changes from this era. And this new weapon, the épée de cour, it didn't just stay in France, did it? It actually spurred a whole new style of fencing.
That's right. Our sources are quite clear on this. They basically say that what we recognize as fencing today really took shape as this new French style began to replace the Italian style, which had been dominant before.
So the Italians were the leaders during the rapier era?
Generally, yes.
Yeah.
But the specific characteristics, the technical demands of using the lighter court sword effectively, well, that gave rise to this new French school.
And that French school then became influential across Europe.
Hugely influential. It spread everywhere. It shows how innovation in one area here, weapon design driven by fashion, can just trigger a complete transformation across a whole discipline.
So the French style, born from using the épée de cour effectively, became the new gold standard.
Pretty much. It shaped not just the techniques, but also the sort of core principles of swordsmanship moving forward.
Now, using these lighter swords, focused on the point, I imagine practice could still be, well, pretty dangerous.
Oh, absolutely. Even a lighter sword is still a sword. Which brings us to another really crucial development from this time: the establishment of conventions, rules for practice, and the introduction of the foil, the fleuret.
The foil, right, for safer training.
Exactly. It's a perfect example of how safety concerns can actually drive innovation. To reduce the risk of injuries during practice, because these court swords were agile and sharp formalized rules or conventions started to appear.
And alongside the rules came a specific training weapon.
Yes, the foil, the fleuret. It was developed specifically as a training sword.
And it had that distinctive button on the tip.
That's right. Our sources say it had a button at the tip, which apparently looked a bit like a flower fleur in French, and that's supposedly where the name foil or fleuret comes from.
Huh, interesting origin for the name. And practice sessions started using specific rules.
Yes, rules limiting where you could score a valid hit on the opponent's body became standard.
This seems like a big step towards, well, sportification.
It really is. It's the formalization of training. These conventions, like limiting target areas, plus the strict etiquette in fencing schools about keeping the point low to avoid face injuries.
This was before masks were common, right?
Right, masks came later, around 1780. So this etiquette was vital. All of this established the basic structure for the regulated rules you see in modern fencing.
So fencing practice changed from something closer to combat simulation.
To a more controlled, instructional, safer environment,
Yeah.
definitely.
And wasn't there a specific rule about only chest hits counting in practice?
Yes, that was a key practice convention. Only hits to the chest counted. Now, that obviously made things much safer.
What?
But as our sources point out, it probably did reduce the realism somewhat if you were training for an actual duel or combat situation.
So a trade-off between safety and pure combat practicality.
Precisely. That's often the case, isn't it? But still, these developments, the foil as a specialized training weapon, the focus on thrusting, the introduction of these conventions, they are absolutely critical links connecting historical swordsmanship to modern sport fencing. No question.
Now, while all this refinement was happening in the fencing schools, we shouldn't forget about dueling.
Yes. Dueling was still very much a thing during Louis XIV's reign, even though it was often officially banned.
So the skills honed in the schools with the épée de cour had very real and sometimes deadly consequences outside the salle.
That's a crucial point. The elegance, the technical skill being developed, wasn't just for show. These were skills applied in life or death situations.
So the dueling culture, even though controversial, probably pushed the emphasis on precision.
Undoubtedly. It likely contributed to that focus on effectiveness and deadly accuracy in swordsmanship.
So if we pull it all together, the reign of Louis XIV saw the masters gain status, fashion drive a weapon change to the épée de cour, the French style emerge, and then practice conventions and the foil come into play.
It really paints a picture of a practice undergoing a fundamental transformation.
It seems like a truly pivotal era for fencing.
Absolutely. If you synthesize all these pieces, Louis XIV's reign was a crucial turning point. It established those fundamental elements we still see in modern fencing.
Like the focus on the thrust.
Yes, the primary emphasis on the thrust, the use of that light, single-handed weapon as the standard, and critically, the implementation of conventions defining valid hits and target areas.
Core principles that remain today.
They really do. These are the foundations upon which modern sport fencing was built.
Speaking of foundations and things we appreciate today, this seems like a good moment to quickly thank our sponsor, Fencing Family.
Yes, definitely.
They're an Etsy shop based out in Los Angeles, and they offer a really great range of unique fencing-themed apparel and accessories.
So if you're a fencer, or maybe looking for a gift for one, they're worth checking out.
For sure. You can find them online easily. Just search for Fencing Family on Etsy or go to https://fencingfamily.etsy.com.
Right, so just to sum up our deep dive then, it's clear Louis XIV's reign was genuinely transformative for fencing,
You had the royal support boosting the masters.
which provided legitimacy and helped the art grow. Then the fashion-driven shift to the court sword revolutionized technique.
And the rise of the French style set a new standard across Europe.
Plus, the development of those practice conventions and the foil created the whole framework for modern training and eventually competition.
It seems like all these factors really did converge to lay the essential groundwork for fencing as the sport we know today.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's the bedrock.
It really makes you think, though, how something seemingly, well, superficial like court fashion could have such a deep and lasting impact on how a practice, even a sport, evolves over centuries.
It's true. Traditions we see today often have these complex, sometimes unexpected roots.
It definitely makes you wonder what other modern sports might have similarly surprising or unexpected origins hidden back in history. Something to ponder, perhaps.